As he walked past the gardener, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw his pendant. The same one his son was wearing when he disappeared many years ago. David, a young man of humble origins, carried in his eyes the hope of a better life. His journey had led him to the majestic Anderson mansion, where he would start his new job as a gardener. As he walked through the massive gates of the estate, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement, aware that this place could be the turning point he had been searching for. Upon arrival, David was met with the stern gaze of Matthew Eyre, the mansion's butler. Matthew was a man of few words, known for his rigid and unforgiving demeanor. As he looked at the young gardener, he narrowed his eyes, as if already anticipating trouble. "I hope you're up to the job, boy," Matthew said in a sharp tone, not hiding his distrust. David just nodded, determined not to let the butler's coldness shake him. With firm steps, he headed to the vast garden that was now his responsibility. The place was stunning, with exotic plants and rare flowers that seemed straight out of a dream. Every detail reflected the care and wealth of the Andersons. While he worked, David could feel Matthew's critical gaze on him, but he kept his focus on his tasks. He knew this was a test, and he was determined to pass it successfully. By late afternoon, the sky darkened quickly, heralding an imminent storm. Lightning streaked across the sky, followed by thunder that echoed throughout the estate. David knew that the garden, with its delicate and valuable plants, was at risk. Without hesitation, he began to protect the plants, using tarps and makeshift ties to ensure that nothing would be destroyed by the force of nature. The storm soon became fierce, with howling winds and torrential rain. Even so, David didn't back down. Under Matthew's watchful eye from a distance, the young man worked tirelessly, facing the elements with admirable determination. It was at that moment that Richard Anderson, the mansion's imposing owner, returned from a business meeting. Seeing the chaos in the garden, he rushed out of the car and, to his surprise, found David bravely fighting against the storm. "What's going on here?" Richard asked, surprised by the scene. Matthew, always ready to criticize, was about to respond when David, breathless and soaked, explained the situation. "I couldn't let the garden be destroyed, Mr. Anderson. I did what I could to protect the plants," David said, still catching his breath. Richard surveyed the scene and realized the monumental effort the young man had made. He turned to Matthew, who was visibly displeased, and spoke firmly. "Matthew, this young man did an excellent job. From now on, I want him to receive all the support he needs. We need people like him here." Matthew had no choice but to nod, though the displeasure was evident on his face. David, for his part, felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. He had earned the respect of Richard Anderson, the most powerful man he had ever met. As the storm began to subside, the connection between David and Richard was just beginning to form, and the tension between the young gardener and the stern butler seemed about to grow. The sky darkened again, no longer because of the storm, but due to the clouds of secrets and intrigues that were beginning to gather over the grand Anderson mansion. In the days following the storm, Richard Anderson began to pay more attention to David. The young gardener, despite his humble position, demonstrated tireless dedication to his work. His calloused hands tended the garden with a skill that impressed everyone at the mansion. But there was something else that caught Richard's eye, a rare honesty and integrity that reminded him of a distant and painful past. One sunny morning, Richard was walking through the garden, enjoying the tranquility before another day of meetings and commitments. As he approached the central fountain, he found David focused, pruning some roses. Richard hesitated for a moment, watching him from afar. Something about the young man intrigued him, an inexplicable feeling that he couldn't ignore. When David stood up to greet him, something hanging around the young man's neck caught Richard's attention. His eyes locked on the moon-shaped pendant, a seemingly simple detail, but one that brought back memories he had tried to bury for years. That small silver moon was identical to the necklace his son, who had disappeared many years ago, used to wear. "Where did you get that necklace?" Richard asked, trying to disguise the emotion threatening to surface in his voice. David, unaware of the impact of his answer, smiled slightly, touching the pendant. "This necklace belonged to my mother. She always said it was a good luck charm. I've worn it for as long as I can remember." Richard remained silent, his heart pounding. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. The necklace, David's behavior, the inexplicable familiarity he felt toward the young man. All of this began to swirl in his mind. bringing up doubts and hopes he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Determined to discover the truth, Richard chose to investigate David's past, but discreetly. He didn't want to alarm the young man or give himself false hopes. He ordered Matthew to gather information about the young man's life before his arrival at the mansion, but without David noticing. While Matthew dedicated himself to this task, Richard couldn't get the image of that necklace out of his head. Deep down, a nearly forgotten hope began to resurface, a spark of possibility that, though unlikely, he couldn't extinguish. In the days that followed, Richard continued to watch David from a distance, trying to find other clues that might clarify the mystery. The young gardener's presence at the mansion, once an almost insignificant detail, now became an enigma that he was determined to solve. With each passing day, the connection between them seemed to grow stronger, even though David was still oblivious to the complexity of the situation. And while the mystery of the necklace lingered in the air, a sense that something greater was about to unfold began to take hold of Richard. The necklace, a simple piece of jewelry, had transformed into a symbol of something much deeper and perhaps more painful. Over time, Richard knew he would have to confront his doubts, but the fear of reliving the past and the possibility of new pain kept him in a state of uncertainty. However, he couldn't deny it. David's presence at the mansion was destined to change everything in ways he couldn't yet foresee. And so, the shadow of the mystery surrounding the necklace began to grow, feeding Richard's curiosity and apprehension, who had no idea how much this silent investigation could change their lives forever. From the moment Richard Anderson laid eyes on the moon-shaped necklace David wore, an unease settled in his spirit. The suspicion, still in its infancy, began to grow, and he knew he couldn't simply ignore it. He needed answers, but above all, he needed the truth. Discreetly, Richard hired the services of a trusted private investigator, an experienced and skilled man, with the mission of digging into David's life from its very roots. The directive was clear: uncover everything possible about the young gardener, especially concerning the orphanage where he was raised and the circumstances of his abandonment. Meanwhile, life at the mansion carried on as usual. David continued his work in the garden, unaware of the investigations unfolding in secret. But Richard, now more attentive than ever, started approaching the young man more frequently, creating opportunities to chat and ask seemingly innocent questions, which were actually carefully crafted. David, you've mentioned before that you grew up in an orphanage," Richard commented during a walk through the garden. Do you remember anything about your family? Any clues about your parents?" David paused for a moment, thoughtful. "Not much, Mr. Anderson. The orphanage was the only home I ever knew. The few things I had when I was found were this necklace and an old blanket. I never knew anything about my parents. And the only thing my foster mother used to say is that I was found on a cold night, left at the orphanage door." These words hit Richard with unexpected force. The idea that David could really be his lost son, abandoned so many years ago, began to solidify. He continued to listen intently, without revealing the storm of thoughts consuming him. As the days passed, the information brought by the private investigator began to paint a clearer, yet still incomplete, picture. A visit to the orphanage confirmed that David had been found as a newborn, with no identification, except for the moon-shaped necklace. The orphanage's director, an elderly man by now, vaguely remembered the night the baby was left there. A distant and nearly forgotten memory. "It was a very cold night," the director told the investigator. "The child was wrapped in a thin blanket, and the necklace was the only thing that seemed to have any value. We kept everything, but we never managed to find out who left him there." These revelations further intensified Richard's doubts and anxiety. He knew the truth was closer, but there were still missing pieces of the puzzle. However, one thing was certain: the necklace was a powerful link, a clue that couldn't be ignored. As Richard became more involved in David's life, the young man began to notice the changes in his employer's attitude. The conversations became more frequent, and the questions more personal. But with the trust that was starting to build between them, David didn't suspect Richard's true intentions, seeing in the questions only the interest of a man who might see him as someone worthy of his consideration. However, the suspense reached its peak when the investigator, in a discreet meeting with Richard, revealed a crucial piece of information. David had been found at only a few weeks old, with no records, no witnesses, and the moon-shaped necklace was indeed the only clue to his origins. Everything indicated that the child had been abandoned by someone who wanted to erase any trace of their connection to the baby. Richard listened carefully to every word, and the weight of this revelation made his heart race. If his suspicions were true, then David could be the son he had lost so many decades ago. But at the same time, uncertainty tormented him. What if he was wrong? What if this new hope was nothing more than a cruel illusion? As these doubts swelled, Richard knew he would need to make a decision soon. He could no longer ignore the evidence, but neither could he reveal his suspicions without absolute certainty. What was at stake was much greater than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the possibility of finding his son again, but also reopening old wounds that had never fully healed. So, as the investigator continued to dig deeper into David's history, Richard prepared himself for an inevitable confrontation with the past, knowing that each new discovery could change their lives forever. The days at the Anderson mansion became increasingly tense for Richard. The discovery of the necklace and the clues revealed by the investigator profoundly affected him. Sleepless nights, filled with memories of his lost son, now mingled with the image of David. Doubt and hope collided in his heart, and he knew he couldn't go on without answers. One morning, determined to confront his feelings, Richard called David in for a conversation in the mansion's office. The room, always formal and austere, seemed even more oppressive at that moment. The walls, adorned with paintings and shelves full of books, silently bore witness to the gravity of what was about to happen. "David, there's something I need to tell you," Richard began, his voice heavy with emotion he struggled to control. "Over the past few days, I've been watching you more closely, trying to understand why I feel this inexplicable connection." David, who was used to seeing Richard as a figure of authority and distance, was surprised by the seriousness in his employer's tone. He felt a chill down his spine as he realized this wasn't just any conversation. "Mr. Anderson, what's going on?" "Did I do something wrong?" David asked, concerned. Richard shook his head, feeling the weight of the words he needed to say. "No, David, you haven't done anything wrong. In fact, you've been an example of honesty and dedication. But there's something I need to share with you. Something that has haunted me for years." He paused, trying to find the right words. David looked at him, anxious and confused, not knowing what to expect. "Many years ago, I lost a son. He disappeared when he was very young, and we never heard from him again. It was the greatest pain I've ever experienced in my life. When I saw that necklace around your neck, the same one my son used to wear, something inside me woke up, a hope I thought was dead." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you trying to say, sir?" Richard took a deep breath before continuing, feeling the weight of the emotions bubbling up inside him. "Wait, David, I believe you might be my missing son. I know this may sound crazy, but the coincidences are too strong to ignore." The silence that followed was almost deafening. David felt his world spin, unable to process what he had just heard. His whole life, he had wondered about his origins, about who his parents were and why he had been abandoned. Now faced with this revelation, a mix of shock, fear, and disbelief took hold of him. "Mr. Anderson, I don't know what to say," David stammered, feeling his legs weaken. "I've always wondered about my parents, but I never imagined something like this." Richard stepped closer, his gaze locked on David's eyes, searching for any answers in the young man's expression. "I understand it's a lot to take in, David. I'm wrestling with my own fears as well. But there's a way for us to find out the truth." David felt the weight of the suggestion before Richard even said it. "You want to do a DNA test?" "Yes," Richard replied, his voice low but steady. "I can't keep living with this doubt. If you're my son, we need to know, and if you're not, at least we'll have certainty." David looked down at the floor, emotions battling within him. His whole life, he had prepared for the possibility of never discovering his origins. And now, this revelation caught him off guard, destabilizing everything he knew. However, a part of him, the same part that had always longed for answers, felt that he couldn't let this chance slip away. "I agree," David finally said, lifting his eyes to meet Richard's gaze. "Well, let's do the test." Richard nodded, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over him. "Thank you, David. I know this isn't easy." But no matter the result, I want you to know that you've been a valuable presence in my life." As the words echoed in the office, the tension in the air was palpable. Both knew that this DNA test could change everything, for better or for worse. The shared anxiety became a constant shadow in the days that followed, as they waited for the results that could confirm or crush their hopes. The revelation was close, and with it, the promise of answers that, though long awaited, could bring to light truths neither of them was entirely prepared to face. The atmosphere in the Anderson mansion grew increasingly heavy with anticipation. The DNA test had been completed, and now Richard and David were at the mercy of the long wait for the results. Each day seemed longer than the one before as the anxiety settled in for both of them. Richard, a man accustomed to having control over all situations, now felt powerless in the face of the unknown. David, on the other hand, battled a flood of emotions that swirled in his heart. During this period, the relationship between the two began to evolve in unexpected ways. The once formal and distant interactions gave way to moments of genuine exchange. Richard, with a newfound curiosity, began to take a deeper interest in David's life, wanting to know the young man not just as a possible son, but as the person he truly was. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Richard broke the silence that had settled between them. "David, did you ever wonder who your parents were? What your life would have been like if you had grown up with them?" David reflected for a moment, feeling the weight of the question. "Many times, Mr. Anderson. When I was younger, I often imagined what my life would have been like if I hadn't been abandoned. But over time, I learned to accept that some questions might never have answers. Until now." Richard nodded, understanding the complexity of David's feelings. "I understand. Life has a strange way of surprising us, doesn't it? I never imagined I'd be here beside someone who might be my son." These conversations became a sort of relief for the tension they both felt. Richard began to share stories of his life, memories of his childhood, and the struggles he faced over the years. David, in turn, spoke about the orphanage, the few friendships he made, and the challenges of growing up without a family. They both discovered that, despite their differences, they had more in common than they had ever imagined. The time they spent together fostered a bond that, while still fragile, began to grow naturally. As this newfound closeness blossomed, a silent shadow loomed over the mansion. Matthew, the loyal butler, watched with growing unease the relationship forming between Richard and David. For years, Matthew had held a position of trust in Richard's life, being more than just an employee but a confidant and advisor. David's arrival and the possibility that he was Richard's long-lost son threatened this position. As the days went by, Matthew could no longer ignore the jealousy gnawing at him. The young gardener, who was once just another employee, now occupied the center of Richard's attention. Matthew felt that if David were indeed confirmed as the lost son, his place in the mansion could be diminished or, worse, lost. And that prospect was unbearable for him. Determined to protect what was his, Matthew began to scheme ways to undermine the relationship between David and Richard. He knew he needed to act cautiously, as any misstep could reveal his intentions. Subtly, Matthew started to sow doubts about David, insinuating that the young man might have hidden motives, that perhaps he wasn't as innocent as he appeared. "Mr. Anderson, young David seems quite adaptable, doesn't he?" Matthew remarked in a casual conversation. "It's admirable, no doubt, but we mustn't forget that he came from a tough environment. You never know what a person learns to survive." Richard, though aware of Matthew's words, was still absorbed in his own thoughts and hopes. He didn't pick up on the subtle warning in the butler's tone. Richard's focus was on David and the DNA test that was about to reveal the truth. However, the poison in Matthew's words began to work silently. The seeds of doubt planted, though small, could grow into painful thorns in the future. As the date of the results revelation approached, the tension in the mansion continued to build. Despite the growing closeness, Richard and David felt the weight of uncertainty. Every glance, every word exchanged carried the expectation of what was to come. And Matthew, lying in the shadows, awaited the right moment to act, determined to protect his position at any cost. And so, the fate of all seemed to be heading toward an inevitable confrontation, where hidden truths and concealed intentions would finally be revealed, forever changing the course of their lives. The days of waiting seemed to stretch into eternity, but finally, the DNA test results arrived. On the morning the envelope was delivered to the Anderson mansion, the air was thick with expectation. Richard, more nervous than ever, held the document in his trembling hands. He knew that those few pages had the power to change their lives forever. With a mix of anxiety and hope, Richard opened the envelope. The words in front of him seemed to dance before his eyes, but the message was clear. David was, indeed, his missing son. The test confirmed what Richard's heart had been suspecting for some time. A whirlwind of emotions hit him: relief, joy, and an overwhelming wave of paternal love that he had kept bottled up for so long. Richard rose from his chair with renewed energy and, without hesitation, went in search of David. He found the young man in the garden, as usual, tending to the plants with his usual dedication. When David saw the expression on Richard's face, he knew immediately that something had changed. "David, my son, it's true. You really are my son," Richard said, his voice choked with emotion, his eyes shining. David, who had been watering a row of flowers, let the hose fall to the ground. Richard's words echoed in his mind like thunder. I'm your son," he stammered, still trying to process the information. Richard stepped forward, placing his hands on the young man's shoulders with a gentle firmness. "Yes, David, you're my son. Finally. I finally found you." For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. The garden, the mansion, even the sky above lost significance in the face of the magnitude of that reunion. David felt a wave of relief and happiness, but also fear and uncertainty. He had found his family, something he had longed for his entire life. But the reality of being the heir to a vast fortune and powerful legacy terrified him. Later that day, still overwhelmed with joy, Richard decided to announce the news to the rest of the family and the mansion's staff. A grand celebration was organized in a matter of hours, with the mansion lavishly decorated for the occasion. The news that David was the Anderson heir spread quickly, and everyone gathered to meet him officially. Night fell and the mansion gleamed under the bright lights. The guests, many of whom were Richard's friends and business partners, were welcomed with champagne and a celebratory atmosphere. David, dressed in an elegant suit for the first time, was introduced to everyone as Richard Anderson's long-lost son, the heir to the family's fortune and empire. But while smiles and toasts were exchanged, a shadow loomed over the party. Matthew, who had always stayed in the background observing the events unfold, now felt the harsh reality of his situation tightening around his heart like a vice. The confirmation that David was the true heir directly threatened his status at the mansion, and the fear of losing his influence over Richard was turning into anger and resentment. As everyone toasted to the new chapter in the Anderson family's life, Matthew kept his distance, his eyes fixed on David. In his mind, plans began to form. He wouldn't allow a young stranger, even if he was Richard's son, to take his place of trust and power. Jealousy and the desire to maintain control were stronger than any loyalty he might have once felt. "I won't let him take over everything," Matthew muttered to himself, his gaze hardening. "Oh, no matter what I have to do, David Anderson will not be the heir to this family's fortune." As the party continued with laughter and music, no one noticed Matthew's dark expression as he slowly distanced himself from the guests, disappearing into the shadows of the night. The danger was just beginning to reveal itself, and David, unaware, was about to face challenges far greater than he ever imagined. What should have been a moment of unity and celebration was, in fact, marking the beginning of a new and dangerous phase in the lives of everyone at the Anderson mansion. And as the music echoed through the halls, the invisible tension between the new heir and the old butler began to grow, foreshadowing an inevitable confrontation that could change everything. The days that followed the big revelation at the Anderson mansion were intense for David. Now officially recognized as part of the family, he was gradually introduced to the complex dealings of the Anderson empire. Richard, proud and enthusiastic about finally having his son by his side, dedicated himself to teaching him the secrets of the business, while Emily, his half-sister, also made efforts to help him adjust to his new reality. Emily, an intelligent and shrewd woman, had always played a crucial role in the family business. She had great respect for her father, and unlike Matthew, did not see David as a threat but rather as an opportunity to strengthen the Anderson family. Even so, she knew that David's adjustment wouldn't be easy, and she made sure to be there for him, offering guidance and support whenever needed. However, the transition to this new life was anything but smooth for David. The pressure to adapt to the luxury, power, and responsibilities that now weighed on his shoulders was overwhelming. Having spent his entire life in a humble environment, he now found himself in a world filled with expectations and demands. Although Richard and Emily were determined to fully integrate him into the family and the business, David struggled to maintain his humility and the values that had always guided his life. But while David worked to find his place, Matthew, the loyal butler, was busy with his own intrigues. Feeling increasingly threatened by David's rise, he began weaving a web of conspiracies aimed at destabilizing the young heir. Matthew, with his privileged position in the mansion and his deep knowledge of the family's secrets, knew exactly where and how to strike. Matthew began his campaign of destabilization subtly. First, he approached the other mansion staff, planting doubts about David's ability to take on his new responsibilities. Well, he may be the blood son, but does he have what it takes to lead the Anderson business? Matthew would insinuate in seemingly innocent conversations. He also wasted no time manipulating small incidents to make it appear that David was incompetent or disloyal. An important account that mysteriously disappeared, a vital document that was lost. All of these began to cast a shadow of doubt over David. Matthew Statter, skilled in manipulation, made these events seem like the result of distraction or disinterest on the young heir's part, when in fact, they were carefully orchestrated by him. David, still adjusting to his new reality, began to feel the pressure. The looks from the staff, once respectful, gradually became suspicious. He realized that despite his new position, not everyone at the mansion was willing to accept him as the heir. There was a silent resistance, a discomfort in the air that he couldn't fully understand. "I feel like I'm not welcome here, Emily," David confessed in a moment of frustration as the two walked through the vast garden. "And I know things have changed quickly, but it feels like I'm always making mistakes. Like everything I do is wrong." Emily looked at her brother with understanding. "David, this transition isn't easy for anyone. Don't expect everyone to adjust to you right away. But you have to be strong. I know you can handle this." Emily's words brought some comfort to David, but the feeling that something darker was going on wouldn't leave him. And indeed, Matthew continued to pull the strings of his invisible web. He knew that to truly destabilize David, he would need to attack not only his confidence but also the trust Richard had in him. The butler began manipulating crucial information, creating situations where it seemed like David was neglecting important business commitments. Slowly, Richard, who had been so proud of his son at first, began to wonder if David was really ready for the responsibility that awaited him. Meanwhile, David continued to struggle with his own feelings of inadequacy. The weight of Richard's expectations, combined with the silent pressure he felt from all sides, began to take its toll. Deep down, he wondered if he was really up to what was expected of him, or if his place was truly in the garden, far from the spotlight and the burden of the Anderson name. As the days passed, tensions in the mansion only grew. David, trying to stay strong, began to realize that his new life wouldn't just be about adapting but about surviving amidst a web of intrigue and unexpected challenges. And as he fought to find his footing, Matthew watched, satisfied with the early signs of his successful destabilization campaign. The shadow of the conspiracies Matthew had started to weave loomed over everyone in the mansion, threatening the fragile harmony that existed between the newly reunited father and son. The power play was just beginning, and the consequences were still uncertain. The days at the Anderson mansion had become a constant internal battle for David. The initial euphoria of finding his real family was beginning to give way to overwhelming pressure as he delved into the complexities of the business world. The responsibility of carrying the Anderson name, of proving himself worthy of his father's legacy, weighed heavier on his shoulders with each passing day. And with this new reality came temptations he had never faced before. David, raised in a humble and simple environment, was now surrounded by a world of luxury and power. With every meeting, with every decision he made, he realized the impact that his new status brought. The allure of opportunities, the possibility of commanding an empire, all of it began to cloud his values, confusing his sense of right and wrong. Matthew, ever observant, noticed this vulnerability in David. The butler, who had already begun to undermine the trust Richard had in his son, now saw an opportunity to attack the young man's integrity directly. He knew that if he could corrupt David, even if only in appearance, He could destroy the relationship between father and son once and for all. Matthew began creating situations where David was forced to make difficult decisions, testing his morality and his ability to resist the temptations of power. On one such occasion, Matthew orchestrated a business opportunity that, at first glance, seemed promising. It was a lucrative proposal but involved questionable practices and a certain degree of dishonesty that went against the principles David had always valued. "David, this is a golden opportunity," Matthew said, seemingly offhand as he presented the documents. "But you need to act fast. There's no time for much deliberation. Sometimes to succeed, you have to make concessions." David looked at the papers, his heart racing. The offer was tempting, but something inside him kept him from accepting it immediately. He felt that something was wrong, an uncomfortable feeling that he was being tested, or worse, manipulated. "And I'm not sure, Matthew, this seems risky. I'm not sure if it's the best path to take," David replied, the hesitation clear in his voice. Matthew Lisier, maintaining the facade of a loyal advisor, gently insisted. "Sometimes risks bring great rewards, David. Don't forget, you're an Anderson now. With that comes the responsibility to do what's necessary to protect your family's legacy." Those words echoed in David's mind, fueling his doubt and insecurity. Being an Anderson, what did that really mean? He felt himself getting lost in a sea of uncertainties, where the lines between right and wrong were beginning to blur. Fortunately, amidst this internal storm, Emily became a safe harbor for David. She, who had always been a strong and balanced figure, noticed her brother's dilemma and decided to intervene. Emily knew that the business world could be cruel and seductive, but she also understood that David needed to hold on to the essence of the man he was before all of this. In a frank conversation, Emily offered her support and advice, helping David to see beyond the surface of the situations he was facing. David, don't let the pressures of this world get to you. Power and money can be tempting, but you can't lose sight of who you really are," she said, sincerity in her eyes. David, touched by Emily's kindness and wisdom, began to distance himself from Matthew's pernicious influence. He found in Emily not just a sister, but an ally amidst the difficulties. The connection between the two grew stronger, based on trust and mutual respect. Emily helped David make more thoughtful decisions, resisting the temptations that Matthew laid in his path. However, even with Emily's support, David continued to be tormented by Matthew's schemes. The butler, seeing that his efforts hadn't yet had the desired effect, began to intensify his tactics. He spread rumors among the staff, suggesting that David was making decisions that would harm the family, trying to make Richard doubt his son's abilities even more. David, in turn, felt the growing weight of these conspiracies. Every step he took felt like walking a tightrope, where one wrong move could mean a fall. The mansion, once a symbol of his reunion with his family, now seemed like a labyrinth of intrigues and traps. And so, as Matthew tightened his grip, trying to drive a wedge between David and Richard and the inheritance that should be his, David fought to keep his integrity intact. He knew the challenges he was facing were just the beginning of a much bigger battle. The temptations and dilemmas that arose each day were proof that, to survive in the Anderson world, he would have to be stronger than he had ever imagined. The shadows at the Anderson mansion were growing deeper, and the young heir began to realize that to overcome the conspiracies and claim his rightful place, he would need to fight not only against external enemies, but also the inner demons threatening to corrupt him. Matthew's schemes, carefully woven over the weeks, finally began to achieve their purpose. The atmosphere at the Anderson mansion became increasingly heavy, and Richard, who had once been so certain of his newly discovered son's goodness and integrity, began to be consumed by doubts. The rumors, the small incidents manipulated by Matthew, and the constant insinuations started to erode the trust he had placed in David. Seeing Richard's fragility, Matthew decided to deliver the final blow. He knew he needed something concrete, something that would leave no room for doubt about David's loyalty. With a meticulous plan in mind, he forged evidence suggesting that David was plotting to seize the family's fortune, betraying his father's trust. Fake documents, manipulated conversations, and bought testimonies painted a grim picture, making David out to be the villain Matthew needed him to be. When Richard found these proofs in his office, he felt the ground fall out from under him. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. The idea that David, his son, could be scheming against him for money was unbearable. Feeling betrayed and confused, Richard decided to confront David, hoping against all logic that there was some explanation for what he was seeing. That night, Richard called David into the office. The air was thick with tension, with the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows, mirroring the inner turmoil of both men. "I found something that you need to explain," Richard said in a somber voice as he threw the forged documents on the table in front of his son. David, seeing the accusations laid out before him, was incredulous. "Dad, this can't be true. I would never do something like this. I would never betray your trust." But David's words, full of sincerity, weren't enough to dispel Richard's doubts. "How can I believe you, David? Everything points to the opposite. Since you arrived here, it seems like everything has started to go wrong. How can I ignore this evidence?" David felt a sharp pain in his chest. This was the father he had barely begun to know, the man whose approval he had longed for so much. And now it seemed like everything was falling apart. "Dad, please, believe me. I never wanted anything other than to be part of this family. I don't know how this happened, but I swear, I am not what these documents say." The argument between the two intensified, with Richard torn between the desire to believe his son and the weight of the evidence before him. Every word exchange seemed to widen the gap between them until finally, devastated and feeling defeated, David made a decision. "Oh, if you can't trust me, Dad, then I can't stay here," David said, tears in his eyes, before turning and walking out of the office. Richard, in silence, watched his son leave, feeling a deep pain that mixed anger, sadness, and a sense of loss that he couldn't explain. At that moment, he believed that perhaps he had made a mistake by bringing David into his life. David, hurt and feeling betrayed, packed his things quickly. What should have been a new beginning had turned into a nightmare. As he left the mansion, he felt like he was leaving behind not just a house, but also the hope of a new life with his real family. However, while the emotional storm raged between Richard and David, Emily watched everything with keen eyes. From the beginning, something about Matthew's actions had bothered her, and she had never fully trusted the butler. The speed at which events had unfolded, the precision of the evidence against David, it all seemed. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily began her own investigation. She reviewed the documents that Richard had shown David, looking for inconsistencies. What she found only heightened her suspicions. Small details in the papers, like dates that didn't make sense or signatures that seemed slightly off, led her to believe that it was all a sham. With her determination renewed, Emily dug deeper, discreetly talking to some of the mansion's staff and combing through old files. Finally, she found the missing piece. A series of correspondences between Matthew and a corrupt lawyer, discussing the creation of documents that could protect the family's interests. When she saw these letters, it became clear to Emily that Matthew was behind everything. With the evidence in hand, Emily confronted Matthew privately. "I know what you did, Matthew. You manipulated my father, destroyed the trust between him and David. But it ends now." Matthew, caught off guard, tried to justify himself, but the firm look in Emily's eyes made it clear there was no room for more lies. "You may have fooled my father, but you didn't fool me. I'm going to show him the truth, and when I do, you'll pay for everything you've done." The battle wasn't won yet, but Emily knew she had to act quickly. The fate of her family depended on her ability to convince Richard that David was innocent. She was determined to repair the damage Matthew had caused and bring David back to the mansion, back to the family he deserved. As the truth began to emerge from the shadows, the tension in the Anderson mansion intensified. The next steps would be decisive in determining the family's future, and Emily knew she couldn't fail. The tension at the Anderson mansion was reaching its peak. Emily, determined to right the wrong that had nearly destroyed the relationship between Richard and David, walked into her father's office with the evidence in hand. Richard's expression, still marked by the pain and confusion of the past few days, reflected the burden he was carrying. The doubts that Matthew had planted had poisoned his heart, driving him away from his son. But now, with the truth about to be revealed, everything would change. "Dad, we need to talk," Emily said, her voice firm but tinged with an urgency that Richard couldn't ignore. He looked at her, sensing that something very serious was about to happen. "Emily, if this is about David, I don't know what to think anymore. The evidence. Everything seemed so clear, but at the same time, none of it makes sense." Emily nodded, understanding her father's confusion. "I know it seemed real, but it was all a lie. Matthew manipulated everything, Dad. He set it up so you would believe David was a traitor, but he's innocent. Look at this." She handed over the documents, the correspondences that exposed Matthew's schemes. Richard took the papers with trembling hands, reading the words that confirmed his worst suspicions. Each line he read, each proof that Matthew had deliberately conspired against David, felt like a knife to his heart. "How could I have been so blind?" Richard murmured as the papers slipped from his hands. "How could I doubt my own son?" Guilt and regret washed over Richard, and in that moment, he knew he had to right the wrong he had committed. Without hesitation, he made a decision. He would go after David and bring him back. The time they had lost, the harsh words exchanged, all of that could be overcome, but he needed to act quickly. As Richard prepared to leave, Emily walked him to the door, holding his hand firmly. "Dad, you're going to bring him back. And together we'll get through this. David needs you, and you need him." Richard nodded, feeling a renewed determination growing inside him. He knew where to find David, and he wouldn't stop until his son was back by his side. David, on the other hand, had returned to the place he had always considered his true home, the orphanage where he grew up. Sitting on a bench in the garden, he watched the children playing in the distance, his mind lost in thoughts about what had happened. The weight of the betrayal he had felt still hung heavy on his heart, but at the same time, he knew he needed to find a new path, far from the expectations and the intrigues that had taken root at the Anderson mansion. But as he pondered his future, a familiar voice called him back to reality. "David." He turned and saw Richard walking toward him, his face marked by regret and anguish. David stood up, surprised, but still carrying the pain he felt inside. "Dad," David said, not sure what to expect from this unexpected visit. Richard stopped in front of him. The words stuck in his throat for a moment before he could finally speak. "David, I made a terrible mistake. I let Matthew's lies poison my heart, and because of that, I doubted you and my own son. I'm so sorry, and I have no excuses. I just want you to know how deeply I regret what happened." David looked at his father, seeing the sincerity and suffering in his eyes. This was the first time he had seen Richard so vulnerable, so willing to admit his mistakes. What Richard didn't know was that, despite all the pain he felt, David had never stopped wanting his father's acceptance and love. "I never wanted anything more than to be part of the family," David said, his voice breaking. "But when you doubted me, it felt like my whole world fell apart. I didn't want to believe that someone could manipulate you like that, but here we are." Richard took a step forward, reaching out but stopping short of touching David, respecting his son's space. "I understand if you need time to forgive me. But please, come home. Let's face this together. Matthew will be punished for what he did. And I promise you, nothing like this will ever happen again." David felt the emotions stirring inside him. Richard's words struck deep, but the wounds were still fresh. However, he knew that standing before him was a chance to start over, to rebuild the relationship he had always wanted. After a long moment of silence, David finally nodded. "I'll come back, Dad. But on one condition. Matthew can't interfere in our lives anymore. I want him to pay for everything he's done." Richard, tears in his eyes, agreed. "I promise you, David, Matthew will no longer be a part of our lives. He'll pay for all of this." With that, the two embraced, the first genuine emotional hug between father and son. The weight of the pain began to lift, replaced by a new hope, a new beginning. Back at the mansion, Richard kept his promise. He confronted Matthew, who finally had to face the consequences of his actions. The butler was removed from the mansion, and all the evidence of his schemes was handed over to the authorities. Justice was beginning to be served, and the shadow he had cast over the Anderson family was finally starting to lift. David, now back with his family, knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but this time he wouldn't face them alone. With Richard by his side, and Emily as his confidant and ally, he was ready to build a future based on truth, trust, and the love he had always longed for. And so, as the Anderson mansion prepared for a new chapter. David's return marked the beginning of a new era, an era where the true strength of the family would be tested and, ultimately, reaffirmed. The tension at the Anderson mansion was palpable. David's return, followed by Emily's revelations, had put the family in a state of alert and expectation. Richard, now aware of Matthew's betrayal, knew he couldn't just let what had happened go. The moment to confront the man who had nearly destroyed his family had finally arrived. That afternoon, Richard called a meeting in the mansion's grand living room. All the members of the Anderson family were present, as well as the key staff who had witnessed the recent events. The atmosphere was somber, and the air felt heavy with the weight of the truths that were about to be unveiled. Matthew, still in his position as butler, entered the room with his usual confidence, but there was a visible tension in his eyes. He knew his time was running out, but he still believed he could find a way out of the situation. After all, he had gotten away with so much before. Richard stood beside David and Emily. His face was marked by anger and pain, but also by a determination no one had seen before. He began to speak, his voice firm as it echoed through the room. "Matthew, you served this family for many years. I trusted you like few others. But now all your lies have been exposed. You manipulated, betrayed, and tried to destroy what matters most to me, my family." Matthew remained silent, but the coldness in his eyes began to melt under the intensity of the moment. He knew there was no way out, but he also knew he still had one last card to play. Richard continued, his voice rising. "You did everything you could to drive David away from me. You made me doubt my own son, my own flesh and blood. But it's over, Matthew. You're fired, and not just that. You're banned from this property, and you'll never set foot here again." The silence in the room was absolute. The staff watched with tense expressions, some in disbelief, others visibly relieved. Matthew, however, managed a cold smile before responding. "So that's it, Richard? Years of service and loyalty, and now you're discarding me like a piece of trash?" he said, his tone dripping with bitterness. "But before I go, there's one last thing you deserve to know." Richard frowned, unable to imagine what else Matthew could possibly reveal. "And what are you talking about?" he asked, impatience evident in his voice. Matthew stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Richard and David. "Us, from the moment David walked into this house, I knew he was your son. From the very beginning, Richard. But I chose not to reveal that information. Why? Because I knew that if David were acknowledged, my place in this mansion would be threatened. I chose to manipulate things in my favor, to keep my power and influence intact." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Richard, overwhelmed by a mix of shock and fury, felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The idea that Matthew had deliberately hidden the truth about his son, all to maintain his position, was almost unbearable. "Not you knew?" Richard's voice was hoarse, incredulous. "You knew and kept it from me." "All this time," Matthew gave a bitter smile. "Yes, I knew. And it was easy, Richard. You were so blinded by your own pain, so desperate for answers, that you never suspected someone so close to you could be deceiving you." David, standing beside his father, felt the anger rising within him. Matthew's words, the arrogance with which he admitted his cruelty, awakened something deep inside. "How could you do this? You didn't just destroy the trust between my father and me, but you manipulated our entire family to satisfy your selfish desire for power." Matthew shrugged, as if the matter were irrelevant. "Power is all that matters, David, and I held it in my hands for years. But it seems my time is up." Richard, still reeling from the revelation, struggled to find the right words. "You have no idea what you've caused, Matthew, but it's over now. I swear you'll never interfere in my family's life again." Matthew, realizing that his game was truly over, let out a sigh of resignation. "It seems so, but remember this. The scars I've left won't heal easily." With those final words, Matthew turned and left the room, leaving the Anderson family in a whirlwind of emotions. The staff, who had witnessed the downfall of the man who once controlled the mansion, stood speechless, unsure how to react. David, feeling a mix of relief and sadness, looked at Richard, who seemed deeply shaken. "Dad, he's gone. Now we can start over." Richard nodded slowly, but the weight of guilt and regret was still evident in his eyes. I don't know how to move past this, David. I let him manipulate us for so long. Emily, always the voice of reason, placed a hand on her father's shoulder. We'll get through this together, Dad. What matters is that the truth has come out, and now we can move forward without Matthew's lies haunting us. David Baigi, finally feeling free to take his place in the family and in the business, knew there was still much work to be done. But with Matthew out of the picture and with the support of his family, he was determined to restore peace to the Anderson mansion and build the future he had always desired. The fight wasn't over yet, but with the truth finally revealed, the Anderson family was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united and stronger than ever. With Matthew's expulsion, the Anderson mansion finally began to breathe a sigh of renewal. The shadows that had lingered over the family for so long were starting to lift, and both Richard and David committed themselves to rebuilding the trust and harmony that had nearly been destroyed. However, little did they know that one last secret, kept hidden for years, was about to come to light and change their lives forever. On a sunny morning, David, still adjusting to his new position within the family, decided to help organize his father's vast office. There were many old documents, memories of the past that Richard had accumulated over the years. As he rummaged through the drawers, David came across a dusty box hidden in the back of a cabinet. It was a simple box, unadorned, but something about it caught David's attention. Curious, he opened the box and found a series of old documents, all related to his biological mother. Hospital papers, correspondences, and finally, a letter that seemed never to have been read. David's heart raced as he recognized his mother's name at the top of the letter. As he read it, his eyes widened in shock. The letter revealed that his mother, whom he had always believed was dead, was actually alive. The words stated that she had been kept away for reasons the letter didn't clearly explain, but the truth was undeniable. His mother was alive. Stunned, David immediately sought out Richard, who was in a meeting, but upon seeing the expression on his son's face, Richard stopped everything to listen to what he had discovered. When David showed him the letter and the documents, Richard's eyes widened with surprise and disbelief. David, I had no idea, Richard said, his voice filled with a mix of astonishment and regret. All I knew was that your mother disappeared after you were born. I never knew she was alive, that she was kept away. The revelations left them both in silence for a moment, as they tried to absorb the impact of this new information. For Richard, the idea that there were more secrets hidden in the past was disturbing, but it also made him determined to uncover the whole truth. For David, discovering that his mother was still alive was a second chance he never imagined he'd have. "But we need to find her," David said, the determination in his voice clear. "She deserves to know that I'm alive, that I'm okay, and I need to meet her." Richard nodded, feeling that after everything they had been through, this search for the truth was necessary for both of them to finally put the past behind them. "We'll find her, David." Together. The search for information began immediately. With the help of old contacts and new allies, Richard and David followed every lead they could until they finally found the whereabouts of Sarah, David's mother. She was living in a small coastal town, far from the chaos of city life, where she had taken refuge all these years. The reunion was emotional and filled with tears. When David saw his mother for the first time, it felt as if all the pieces of his past were finally coming together. Sarah, who had lived with the pain of believing she had lost her son forever, could hardly believe it when she saw him standing in front of her. A grown man, but with the same eyes she remembered from her baby. "David," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "Is it really you?" David ran to embrace her, feeling the warmth and security he had searched for his entire life. "Mom, it's me. I'm finally home." Richard, watching the scene, felt his own heart swell with a mix of joy and sadness. He knew there was much to explain, many truths to be revealed, but for now, that moment of reunion was all that mattered. In the days following the reunion, the truths about the past began to surface. Sarah revealed that she had been forced to stay away from David right after his birth, due to pressures and threats she never fully understood. Now together, they began to unravel the web of manipulations that had kept mother and son apart for so long. Richard, feeling responsible for not knowing or doing more to protect his family, asked for Sarah and David's forgiveness. "I never wanted you to go through this. I was blind to what was happening. But I promise that from now on, nothing will separate us again." Sarah, moved by Richard's sincerity, accepted his apology, recognizing that the true villain had been the one who manipulated them all, Matthew, whose legacy of lies was now finally undone. The moon-shaped necklace, which David had always carried as a symbol of his lost identity, now became a symbol of his reconciliation with the past. Sarah explained that the necklace had been a special gift, given to David on the day he was born, and that she had always believed it would protect him. With the family finally reunited, the Andersons entered a new era. The truth, though painful, brought a sense of liberation none of them had expected. The mansion, once the stage for so much intrigue and pain, was now a place of renewal and hope. David Hunt, with his mother by his side and Richard as the father he had always wanted, was ready to take his place in the Anderson family, but this time with the certainty that love, truth, and unity would prevail above all else. The past, marked by pain and loss, was finally replaced by a future where the Anderson family could thrive, stronger and more united than ever. And the moon-shaped necklace, hanging around David's neck, became a symbol of this new era, a reminder that, despite everything, the truth always finds its way, and love always triumphs.